The billionaire was about to say, "I do," until the maid's toddler handed him a crumpled letter. Nobody expected a toddler to change the outcome of a billionaire's wedding with a single piece of paper. The ceremony was already running, the vows already halfway spoken. Alexander Hayes stood at the altar in a black tuxedo, his voice steady as he repeated the words the pastor fed him, one line at a time. 600 guests watched in reverent silence. Cameras clicked softly from the balcony. Then a small hand tugged at his sleeve. He looked down to find a 3-year-old girl in a wrinkled blue dress, her curls escaping their careful braids, holding up a crumpled yellowed envelope with both hands, like it was the most important thing in the world. "The lady said give this to you," she whispered, "before you say the words." Alexander's breath caught. He recognized the handwriting on the envelope before he even opened it. Handwriting he hadn't seen in 3 years. Handwriting that belonged to a woman who had been dead since before this child was even born. His late wife's handwriting. Sophia, the bride, stared at the envelope with an expression that flickered, for one unguarded second, into something closer to panic than confusion. Everyone in that church expected a wedding. Nobody expected a dead woman's letter to walk down the aisle in a toddler's hands. And nobody expected what that letter would reveal about the child who carried it. Welcome back, and if this is your first time here, subscribe because this story is about to take you somewhere unforgettable. This is a story about a promise kept across the boundary of death, a secret protected by a single mother for 3 years, and a truth so carefully hidden that even the billionaire at the center of it never suspected it existed. By the end, you'll understand exactly what Margaret Hayes wrote in that letter, and why she trusted it to a maid instead of to her own husband. You'll understand why a little girl who called nobody daddy was about to change one man's entire life with 4 short sentences. Stay with me until the end, because the final twist in this story will make you rewatch the beginning with completely different eyes. Emily Carter had learned to carry weight without letting it show on her face. She was 24 when she found out she was pregnant, alone, with no family to call and no partner willing to stay. The father disappeared before the 2nd trimester, leaving nothing behind but a phone number that no longer worked. Emily remembered standing in a free clinic waiting room, clutching an ultrasound photo, doing math in her head that never quite added up. Rent, formula, diapers, hope. She gave birth to Lily in a public hospital with a kind but overworked nurse holding her hand, because there was no one else in the room to hold it. She went back to work 11 days later, because 11 days was all she could afford to miss. For 3 years, Emily worked herself past exhaustion. She cleaned office buildings before dawn, waited tables in the evenings, and eventually found steady, better-paying work on the household staff of the Hayes estate, a job she treated like a lifeline because it was one. She skipped meals more often than she'd ever admit. She wore second-hand shoes with cardboard tucked into the soles. She sold the only piece of jewelry she owned, a small gold locket from her late grandmother, to cover a month Lily had a fever that wouldn't break and a doctor's visit she couldn't otherwise afford. But every night, no matter how her body ached, she sat beside Lily's bed and told her she was loved, safe, and never, ever alone. What none of the household staff knew, what Emily had never told a single soul in 3 years, was that her connection to this family ran far deeper than employment. She had made a promise years ago in the quiet, fading days of a woman's final months, and she had kept that promise every single day since, at a cost she never once let anyone see. What happened next would test that promise more than anything ever had. But that wasn't the real surprise waiting inside the crumpled envelope. Lily Carter was 3 years old, and she had a habit of asking questions adults didn't know how to answer. She noticed the framed photograph in the east sitting room, a woman with kind eyes and a gentle smile, and asked more than once why nobody ever talked about the pretty lady. She noticed that a particular rocking chair by the nursery window was never sat in, though it was dusted every single week without fail. She noticed that Mr. Hayes sometimes stopped walking entirely when he passed that room, as though his feet simply forgot how to move forward. Lily had an unusual gift for a toddler her age. She remembered things with startling clarity, small details that seemed to lodge themselves permanently in her mind. She remembered the exact melody of a music box she'd heard only once. She remembered the smell of lavender that clung to an old cardigan in a cedar chest nobody was supposed to open. She remembered, somehow, the shape of a woman's handwriting on an old grocery list tucked inside a kitchen drawer. Handwriting she had never been formally taught to recognize, and yet pointed to instantly the first time she saw the crumpled envelope in her mother's keepsake box. "That's the lady's writing," she'd said one evening, completely unprompted, tracing the looping letters with one small finger. "The one from the picture." Emily had gone very still that night, and quietly moved the keepsake box to a higher shelf. Lily loved humming a soft tune with no words, one Emily never taught her and couldn't identify no matter how hard she tried. She loved sitting in that untouched rocking chair whenever the housekeeping staff wasn't looking, swinging her small legs, perfectly content, as if she belonged there. She loved the garden's lavender bushes more than any other flower on the estate, always pausing to bury her face in them. Everyone found it charming. Emily found it something closer to unbearable, because she knew, better than anyone alive, exactly why her daughter felt so at home in rooms she had never officially been welcomed into. Nobody else knew the truth yet. But Lily, without understanding a single piece of it, was quietly circling closer to a secret that had waited 3 long years to be found. Alexander Hayes had built one of the largest real estate empires on the East Coast, and by 45, his name was etched into skylines across 3 cities. To the world, he was the definition of success. To himself, he was a man who had lost the one thing his money could never buy back. 3 years ago, his wife Margaret had died after a long battle with a heart condition she'd hidden from almost everyone until the final months, insisting, even from her hospital bed, that she didn't want her illness to define the time they had left together. Her death left Alexander with a grief so total that he sometimes forgot, for whole minutes at a time, how to simply exist in a room without her. He remembered small things obsessively, the way loss makes a person cling to detail. The specific way she hummed while gardening. The lavender sachets she kept in every closet. The rocking chair she'd bought years earlier, for a nursery that, as far as he knew, had never once been used. He and Margaret had spent years quietly trying to have a child, through heartbreak after heartbreak, a private grief they carried together and told almost no one about. When Margaret died, Alexander assumed that particular dream had simply died with her. After her passing, he threw himself into work with a ferocity his board considered impressive and his mother considered alarming. He expanded into markets that bored him. He signed contracts late into the night rather than return to a house that felt too quiet. He funded, anonymously, an entire pediatric wing at the city's largest hospital, a gesture his attorney understood, and no one else did. Then Sophia Reed entered his life, confident, magnetic, endlessly reassuring, and for the first time in 3 years, Alexander allowed himself to imagine a future that didn't feel like walking through fog. He told himself Margaret would have wanted him to move forward. He didn't yet know that the daughter he believed he'd never have was, at that very moment, humming Margaret's favorite tune in the garden of his own estate. Sophia Reed had a talent for making rooms feel like they belonged to her. She entered every gathering with a practiced ease, greeted every guest by name, and remembered exactly which charities mattered to which donors. To the world, she was exactly the kind of poised, accomplished woman a man like Alexander Hayes was expected to marry next. Underneath that polish was a woman quietly running out of options. Sophia's family's business empire had crumbled 2 years earlier under the weight of bad debt and worse decisions, and she had watched, humiliated, as her name slipped off invitation lists that once opened every door in the city. She promised herself, somewhere in that fall from grace, that she would never again be the woman standing outside a room she used to be welcomed into. Meeting Alexander, grieving and guarded, felt to her less like romance and more like rescue. She was cool toward the household staff whenever no one important was watching, visibly irritated whenever Lily wandered too close during formal events, and dismissive of Emily's quiet, constant presence in Alexander's daily orbit. She once accidentally had the lavender bushes near the garden path uprooted for renovation, offering no explanation and no apology when Alexander asked why. She made hushed calls late at night, always from the far end of the terrace, always lowering her voice the moment footsteps approached. She kept a locked drawer in her private office that staff were expressly forbidden to touch, even to dust. And every time Margaret's name came up in conversation, something tightened behind Sophia's eyes. Not the polite discomfort of a stranger hearing about a dead woman, but something closer to calculation. Nobody suspected a thing yet. But that wasn't the real surprise hiding behind her practiced smile. The first incident happened at a charity gala, 4 months before the wedding. Lily had approached Sophia holding out a small hand-drawn picture, the way children do when they want approval from someone. Sophia glanced at it for half a second before turning away, saying coldly to a nearby guest, "Someone really needs to keep the help's child out of the main hall." Emily, standing near the catering table, felt the words land like a slap she couldn't return. The second incident came weeks later, when Lily was found humming her wordless tune near the study, and Sophia snapped at her to stop that noise, with a sharpness that made even the housekeeping staff exchange uneasy glances. The third incident cut deeper. Sophia discovered Lily sitting in the untouched rocking chair by the nursery window, and had the chair removed from the house entirely by the next morning, replacing the room with generic guest furniture. When Alexander asked what happened to it, Sophia said simply that, "Old furniture doesn't belong in a home that's moving forward." Alexander, still not fully able to sit in that room himself, let it go. The fourth incident involved attorney James Walker, who mentioned during a routine visit that certain estate matters from Margaret's passing still required final review before the wedding proceeded. Sophia's expression shifted instantly, and she steered the conversation elsewhere within seconds. The fifth, quietest incident happened late one night, when Emily found Sophia standing outside the nursery door, simply staring at it, an unreadable expression on her face. When she noticed Emily, Sophia recovered instantly, offering a smooth excuse about checking on renovation plans. Emily said nothing, but she noted with growing unease that Sophia seemed far too interested in a room she claimed held no meaning to her at all. 3 weeks before the wedding, Emily overheard something that made her blood run cold. She had gone to collect fresh linens near Sophia's private office when she heard her voice, tight and urgent, through the partially open door. "I told you it's under control," Sophia was saying into her phone. "The lawyer doesn't have the full file. As long as that letter never surfaces, none of this touches me." Emily froze mid-step, linens forgotten in her arms. "No," Sophia continued, voice dropping lower. "If Alexander finds out about the surrogacy arrangement before the wedding, the whole prenup falls apart, and everything I've worked for goes with it." The call ended abruptly. Emily backed away in silence, her heart hammering so violently she was certain it would give her away. 2 days later, James Walker arrived at the estate carrying a slim file he guarded with unusual care. He met privately with Alexander for nearly an hour, and when Alexander emerged, his face carried a confusion Emily hadn't seen since the week Margaret died. That evening, Emily discovered a partially shredded document in Sophia's private trash bin, fragments of a legal term she recognized instantly, having lived it herself for 3 years. Gestational surrogacy agreement. She didn't yet understand exactly how much Sophia knew, but her instincts told her the secret she had guarded alone for 3 years was no longer entirely safe. Meanwhile, Lily had begun asking questions no one could fully answer. "Why does the lady in the picture look like me?" she asked one night, tracing the framed photograph in a book Emily hadn't realized she'd found. "Was she my grandma?" Emily's hands stilled over the dishes she was drying. "What makes you ask that, baby?" "I don't know," Lily said simply, already drifting toward sleep. "I just feel like I know her." Emily didn't sleep at all that night. The next morning, Emily made a decision that terrified her. While delivering fresh towels to Sophia's private office, a task usually handled by another staff member who had called in sick, Emily noticed the locked drawer slightly ajar, forgotten in the morning's hurried departure. She knew she shouldn't look. She looked anyway. Inside was a private investigator's report, dated 6 weeks earlier, detailing a search into unresolved matters from the estate of Margaret Hayes. Attached was a photocopy of a gestational surrogacy contract, heavily redacted but unmistakable in its core details. naming a surrogate whose identity had been carefully blacked out, and a biological father listed simply as H. Pinned beneath it was a handwritten note in Sophia's tight, hurried script. If a biological heir surfaces before the wedding, the entire estate structure changes. Find the child. Find the mother. Handle it quietly before the ceremony. Emily's hands shook so badly she nearly dropped the folder. Somehow, impossibly, Sophia had uncovered fragments of the very secret Emily had protected in silence for 3 years. Not the full truth, but enough of it to be dangerous, enough to threaten everything Emily had built to keep Lily safe. Footsteps sounded down the hallway. Emily closed the drawer exactly as she'd found it, slipping out seconds before Sophia returned, her pulse roaring in her ears. She said nothing to anyone that day. She held Lily a little tighter that night, pressing a kiss into her hair, whispering promises she suddenly wasn't sure she could keep on her own anymore. Because now she understood with cold certainty that the wedding was no longer just a ceremony. It was a countdown. For the next 2 weeks, Emily carried the weight of what she knew like a stone lodged behind her ribs. She thought more than once about walking straight into Alexander's office and telling him everything. The surrogacy, the promise, the letter Margaret had entrusted to her years ago and told her never to deliver until the timing felt truly right. Every time she stopped at the door, hand raised, and lowered it again. She was terrified of being disbelieved. Terrified of losing the only job that had ever let her keep her daughter fed and safe. Terrified, most of all, that revealing the truth herself, rather than letting it unfold as Margaret had intended, might somehow break the fragile trust she'd spent 3 years protecting. She thought constantly of Margaret during those sleepless nights. Not the polished photograph in the sitting room, but the real woman she had come to know intimately during the final fragile months of her life. She thought of a quiet hospital room, a trembling hand gripping hers, a promise made through tears neither of them could stop. "Promise me you'll protect her," Margaret had whispered. "Not as a secret to hide, but as a gift to give, when he's ready to receive it, not before." Emily had promised. She had kept that promise every day since, at a cost she never let anyone see. Meanwhile, Alexander noticed his own quiet unraveling. Small inconsistencies kept surfacing that he couldn't explain. Sophia's evasiveness around estate matters, James's unusually cautious tone in their last meeting, a persistent nagging feeling he tried to dismiss as pre-wedding nerves. He didn't yet know how right that instinct was. The wedding was 1 week away, and inside a small keepsake box on a high shelf, a crumpled envelope waited, exactly where Emily had hidden it 3 years earlier, closer to finding its way home than anyone realized. The wedding of Alexander Hayes and Sophia Reed was, by every measure, the social event of the year. 600 guests filled the estate's grand chapel, white peonies lining every pew, a full orchestra weaving through the crowd's hushed anticipation. 3 major publications had secured exclusive coverage. Sophia had spent nearly a year perfecting every detail, down to the precise ivory shade of the aisle runner. Emily had been asked, almost as an afterthought, to help manage the youngest guests during the ceremony, including Lily, dressed in a small blue dress, entrusted with a basket of rose petals she clutched with fierce concentration. Emily's stomach had been in knots the entire morning. She still hadn't found the courage to say anything aloud. James Walker arrived early, his slim file tucked securely under one arm, his expression unusually grave for a wedding day. He requested a private word with Alexander before the ceremony, a request Alexander, caught in the momentum of the day, promised to honor right after. That promise would not be kept in time. The ceremony began precisely on schedule. Alexander stood at the altar, jaw tight, doing his best impression of a man fully present. Sophia appeared at the end of the aisle in a gown that had taken 5 fittings to perfect, radiant, composed, and closer than she had ever been to securing everything she'd worked toward. The vows began. Alexander's voice was steady, mechanical, distant. Lily, standing near the front with her basket of petals, suddenly went very still. Her small head tilted the way it always did right before she noticed something no one else had. Her free hand slipped instinctively into the front pocket of her dress, where a crumpled envelope, the very one Emily had hidden years ago, the one Lily had quietly discovered and tucked away that very morning without telling anyone, waited, forgotten by everyone except the one person too young to understand its weight. Alexander was midway through his vows when small footsteps crossed the aisle, unhurried and utterly fearless. Security Chief Daniel Ross moved instinctively to intercept, but something in Alexander's face, a flicker of recognition, of dread, of hope he didn't dare name, made him hesitate, and in that hesitation, Lily reached the altar. She held up the crumpled envelope with both hands. "The lady said give this to you," she said, her voice small but perfectly clear in the silent chapel. "Before you say the words." Alexander stared down at the envelope, and every guest in that church watched the color drain slowly from his face as he recognized the handwriting looping across the front. "For Alexander, when he's ready." "Where did you get this?" he whispered, kneeling slowly to meet her eyes. "It was in Mommy's box," Lily said simply. "I wanted you to have it before the wedding was finished." The lady in the picture said it was important. A wave of confused murmurs rippled through the guests. Evelyn Hayes rose halfway from her seat, one hand pressed to her mouth. James Walker stepped forward instinctively from the second row, recognizing the handwriting from a lifetime of managing Margaret's affairs. "That's Margaret's handwriting," he said, loud enough for the front rows to hear. "I would know it anywhere." Sophia's composed expression cracked for the first time all day, her hands tightening around her bouquet until her knuckles went white. Alexander turned toward Emily, standing frozen near the side aisle, his voice barely a whisper. "Emily, what is this?" For the first time in 3 years, Emily had run out of ways to delay the truth. James Walker stepped forward, his slim file finally open in his hands. "Alexander, I think it's time you saw everything. All of it." Inside was the truth Emily had carried alone, corroborated now by James's own careful, private investigation. An investigation he'd quietly begun the moment Sophia insisted on rushing the estate paperwork ahead of the wedding, a red flag his decades of experience refused to ignore. Years earlier, after repeated heartbreak trying to conceive, Alexander and Margaret had pursued gestational surrogacy in careful secrecy, wanting to protect themselves from public speculation until they knew the pregnancy would hold. Margaret, already managing a heart condition she'd hidden from almost everyone, had been advised that carrying a child herself could be fatal. Emily, then a young woman searching desperately for stable work and even more desperate for a way forward, had been matched through a private clinic as their gestational surrogate, carrying an embryo created from Alexander and Margaret's own genetic material. Margaret's health declined faster than anyone anticipated. She died just weeks after Lily's birth, before the final legal parentage documents could be completed, before she ever found the strength to tell Alexander the arrangement had succeeded. Terrified in her final days, that grief and joy arriving together might be more than he could survive at once. In her last lucid week, she wrote the letter, sealed it, and made Emily promise to raise Lily herself, quietly, safely, and to deliver the truth only when Alexander was emotionally ready to receive it, not a moment before. Sophia, meanwhile, had uncovered fragments of the surrogacy arrangement through her own hired investigator, terrified that a biological heir would append the prenuptial agreement she'd spent months carefully engineering in her own favor. She had been actively searching for Lily and Emily in the weeks before the wedding, not to reunite a family, but to quietly remove the one obstacle standing between her and total control of Alexander's estate. Gasps rippled through the chapel. Evelyn Hayes was openly weeping. Alexander stood frozen at the altar, the letter shaking in his hands, staring down at a daughter he never knew he had. A daughter who had just delivered, in complete innocence, the single greatest secret of his entire life. The wedding dissolved into chaos, but chaos slowly gave way to something quieter. Grief and joy arriving together, exactly as Margaret had once feared, and somehow exactly as Alexander proved able to survive. He sank to his knees at the altar, Margaret's letter clutched in one hand, Lily's small hand suddenly, instinctively, finding its way into the other. 3 years of unprocessed loss broke open in front of 600 witnesses, tears finally falling for a wife he'd never truly finished grieving, and for a daughter he was only just beginning to know. Security escorted Sophia from the estate within the hour, her carefully constructed future collapsing in real time as guests parted in stunned silence. Formal legal proceedings would follow. Fraud, concealment, and attempted manipulation of estate documents, once James Walker's full investigation reached the district attorney's office. Emily stood frozen near the side aisle throughout it all, watching the secret she had guarded alone for 3 years finally step into the light she'd been promised it would one day reach. It was Alexander who approached her first, his eyes red-rimmed, his voice barely above a whisper. "You've known this whole time," he said. It wasn't an accusation. It was finally understanding. "I promised Margaret," Emily said, her own voice breaking. "She made me promise I'd protect her, and only tell you when you were ready. I was so scared of getting the timing wrong. I was scared of losing everything if I told you too soon." Alexander looked down at Lily, who gazed up at him with an unmistakable warmth in her eyes. Margaret's warmth, he realized now, a resemblance he'd somehow never let himself fully see before today. "Why didn't she ever tell me herself?" he asked quietly. "Because she was terrified," Emily whispered. "That if she told you both things at once, that she was dying and that you finally had the daughter you'd both wanted so badly, it would break you completely. She wanted to give you time. She wanted you to find joy again before you found this." In the weeks that followed, the Hayes estate slowly transformed from a house full of quiet grief into something that finally felt, again, like a home. The investigation into Sophia Reed expanded rapidly, confirming everything Emily and James had uncovered, and revealing the full extent of her plan to erase Lily's claim before it could ever surface, a plan built entirely on desperation and ambition with no room left for conscience. Alexander spent those weeks doing something he hadn't allowed himself to do in 3 years. Grieving Margaret fully, openly, while simultaneously falling in love with the daughter she had given him without either of them knowing. He had the nursery restored, the rocking chair returned to its rightful place by the window, lavender planted once again along the garden path Sophia had torn up months before. He sat in that chair every evening now, Lily curled against his chest, reading the same books Margaret had once carefully chosen and never gotten the chance to read aloud herself. He formally recognized Lily as his biological daughter, initiating legal parentage proceedings within days of the wedding's collapse, ensuring nothing about her place in the family could ever again be questioned or threatened. He established a trust in Emily's name, not out of obligation, but out of genuine, overdue gratitude for 3 years of impossible, quiet sacrifice she had never once used as leverage, never once complained about, even when it would have been easier to walk away. Evelyn Hayes, who had never trusted Sophia, wept openly the first time she held her granddaughter, whispering that Margaret would be so proud of the family finally finding its way back to itself. Slowly, carefully, a fractured household began piecing itself back together. Not the family anyone had expected walking into that chapel, but exactly the family it had always quietly been. Weeks later, Alexander finally opened Margaret's letter in full, alone in the nursery, with Lily asleep against his shoulder. "My love," it began, in Margaret's familiar, looping handwriting. "If you're reading this, then Emily has kept her promise, and our daughter has finally found her way home to you." The letter revealed something Emily herself had never fully known. Margaret hadn't simply chosen Emily at random through the surrogacy clinic. Years earlier, before either woman knew the other, Margaret had quietly funded Emily's community college tuition through an anonymous scholarship program, moved by a letter Emily had written describing her dream of building a stable, safe life for a future family of her own. When the surrogacy agency later matched them, Margaret recognized Emily's name instantly, and chose in that moment to keep the connection secret, wanting Emily to be selected on her own merit as a compassionate, resilient young woman, not out of charity or obligation. "I didn't just trust her with our daughter because she was available," the letter continued. "I trusted her because I had already seen, years before you ever met her, exactly the kind of woman she was capable of becoming. I was right about her, Alexander. I hope in the end you'll agree I was right about everything." Alexander read the final lines through tears he no longer tried to hold back, understanding at last that Margaret's love had reached far beyond her own lifetime, quietly shaping not just the family she left behind, but the very woman who had protected it in her absence. He found Emily in the garden that evening and, for the first time, told her everything Margaret's letter had revealed. Emily wept for a woman she now understood had shaped the course of her entire life long before either of them ever knew it. There is a particular kind of love that plans beyond its own lifetime. The kind that writes letters it may never see delivered, that trusts strangers with a family's most precious secret, that chooses hope over fear even from a hospital bed with limited time left. Margaret's love for Alexander didn't end with her death. It simply changed shape, quietly guiding events years into the future, trusting that the right people, given enough time, would find their way to the truth. Emily's courage reminds us that keeping a promise is not always loud or dramatic. Sometimes it looks like 3 years of silent sacrifice, of carrying a secret at enormous personal cost, simply because someone once trusted you to. And Lily reminds us of something adults too often forget, that innocence, uncomplicated by fear or strategy, sometimes accomplishes what months of careful planning cannot. A 3-year-old delivering a crumpled envelope achieved what an entire investigation had not yet managed to bring into the light. Sophia's downfall teaches us, too, that ambition built on concealment eventually collapses under its own weight, that no amount of careful planning can outrun a truth patient enough to wait for the right moment to arrive. Family, this story reminds us, is sometimes built quietly, in secret, by people who love us enough to wait, even years, even from beyond death, for the exact right moment to let that love finally be known. Now I want to hear from you. Which moment moved you the most? Lily walking that envelope down the aisle, or Margaret's letter finally revealing just how far her love truly reached? Did you suspect the surrogacy twist? Or did it completely catch you off guard? And if you were in Emily's position, carrying a promise like that for 3 years, at real personal cost, would you have had the courage to keep it as long as she did? Tell me in the comments below. I read every single one. If this story moved you, please hit like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss the next emotional journey. And if you know someone who needs a reminder that love can outlast even death itself, share this video with them. Thank you for watching until the very end. I'll see you in the next story.